the research program called PARI, the accompanying research on the investments to end hunger by BMZ, the cooperation with the Malabo Montpellier panel. I will say a few more words on that, and Usman Badiane will do so as well. And actually, there is a broad audience here in the room from Welthungerhilfe, including the General Secretary, Matthias Mogge. Matthias, you and your team must still be exhausted from launching the Welthunger Index a few days ago. You are in challenging times. We all are in challenging times in the related to the world food situation. Also, I welcome Martin Keim, director at CEF, in the field related to science and technology and economics and food security. And there are many more here in the room, and I understand about 70 online who listen in. Colleagues, I want to make a few introductory remarks on what this seminar is about. As Ms. Oppermann has already highlighted, we are in a multidimensional crisis of 7 features: the COVID-19 disrupting food value chains, the climate change destroys food systems resilience, wars add to uncertainty and hinder trade, food price inflation undermines healthy diets, which become unaffordable. High energy prices and raw material prices, especially fertilizer costs, which have also been mentioned already, constrain agriculture and food industries. The accumulating debts cut social protection and nutrition programs, and we have the rampant destruction of nature, erosion of biodiversity and food security. Let me add, it is reassuring that at the ongoing meetings of World Bank and IMF and development banks currently taking place in Washington, DC, the food issues are high on the agenda. Federal Minister Schulze is placing the reform agenda for international finance, addressing the debt issues and the global public goods issues high on the agenda, and that relates to the food crisis as well. Mitigation is not sufficient. More focus on resilience will be a call at COP27. Resilience entails 3 things: mitigation, bending the warming curve down; adaptation, the reductions in risk exposure and enhancement of adaptive capacity needs to be invested more, serving the vulnerable 4 billion people; and transformation, changing lifestyles. So I'm equally optimistic as Anke Oppermann that there will be a change in the COP27 compared to COP26. COP26 had not the word food, not the word agriculture, not the word water in its closing statement. That will be different, I understand, from African negotiators. We have products to discuss here and their content. From potentials to reality, transforming Africa's food production is the book which we happen to launch today also. We have it right here. Let me hold it up, and Heike Baumüller will later on talk to the content a lot more. You see from this slide that the book emphasizes not only sector-specific priorities in the classical agricultural domains, but also systemic investments, governance issues, and cooperation. The PARI program has lots of partners. Time is too short, but this volume draws on years of PARI research with partners in Africa, India, and Germany. The volume exists in English and German. Heike will later break the news that it's beneficial to have joined virtually or in person in this room, because she will be kind enough to launch a lottery, handing out 10 copies free. Maybe she even agrees to co-sign it for those who are winners. By the way, those of you who don't win a hard copy, don't be sad. The book is virtually also accessible on the website free of charge. But I mean, it's good to have this on your bookshelf. Secondly, we have the Malabo Montpellier panel with us today, with distinguished representatives, Usman Badiane, who is co-chair of the panel. I'm also one of those, but we also have Dorothy Okello with us. I will introduce her later on. Katrin Glatzel is here with us, who is the manager of the Malabo Montpellier panel. This Malabo Montpellier panel is an excellent think tank of leading academics and policy advisors in Africa, with a few members also from Europe and from India. The panel produces 2 reports per annum. The most recent one was called Nature's Solutions, Bioeconomy Opportunities in Africa. Well, these were my introductory remarks. I would like now to move on to, actually we can shut down the slides, to the panelists. The panelists will have a chance to give brief introductory remarks, but we mainly would like to instigate discussion among you and with the audience online and here in the room. First comes Dr. Usman Badiane, the founder and executive chairperson of Academia 2063. He holds a PhD in agricultural economics from University of Kiel in Germany. Usman, we don't speak German today in this session, although you are perfect at that. He is a distinguished fellow of the African Association of Agricultural Economists, recipient of the Africa Food Prize in 2015, and member of the World Academy of Sciences, called TWAS. He has over 30 years of experience as academic and a practitioner in international development. He was instrumental in developing and guiding the implementation of the Comprehensive African Agriculture Development Program called CADEP, when he was director for Africa at IFPRI. Usman, you have the floor. I think it would be kind of you speaking no longer than 5 to 7 minutes. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Joachim, for the warm welcome. And thank you to everybody who's taken time to join us here today. I think the issue that brings us here together today, talk about resilience to shock and how we can increase our preparedness and responsiveness, is more than a timely question. You just referred to it. We are being just hammered from so many different angles, from the health front to peace and conflicts, to world market disruptions. And then, of course, what we don't talk about because they may not be global, but locally they're very important, droughts like in the Horn of Africa, and floods and landslides. So there's really quite a lot going on, affecting livelihoods of communities around the globe, and certainly also in Africa as well. If there's anything in the last 3 to 4 years from COVID and before that Ebola in West Africa, but from COVID to the Ukraine crisis, looking at what's happening, these are signs of things to come, probably, and to intensify in the future. If you haven't done that before, now is the time to think about how to live with these shocks as they happen, how to adapt and respond to them better. My bottom line is it should not be normal that a temporary shock leads to large-scale suffering and perhaps even permanent damage. That is where we need to be more regarding and try to disentangle and disconnect. Shocks are here to stay, but they don't have to lead to large-scale suffering or to permanent damage among our communities. And in order to do that, there are several things we will have to think about. There are parts of the world where it doesn't happen, by the way. So therefore, there are things that they're doing right. And in Africa, we should start looking at it and see how we can ensure that we can disconnect. I think the first thing that we will need to do is to understand that the suffering we see and the disruptions we see when we have these shocks are nothing but the tip of the iceberg. They're coming on top, above, and beyond chronic vulnerabilities that have not been addressed, are still going unaddressed. So the first entry point for us to disconnect shock from large-scale suffering is to invest in understanding the drivers, the nature, and the patterns of vulnerability across our communities. That's the first thing. We're just paying attention when there's a shock and where there's really some disruption. We need to understand them better in a much more systemic way, and then next, to find solutions to deal with the level of chronic vulnerability and bring it down so that the absorption capacity of shocks can be supported and built and strengthened. That includes investing in the data and the metrics to track and to monitor, but also investing in building the assets and the productive capacities of these different communities that we are looking at. I think working around the main triggers of vulnerability right now, we just talk about climate change and what it does, the way it is changing the productive base, the way it is changing the environment for agriculture, the way it is creating disruptions around health, around pests, around disease. All those things need to be tackled to build the resilience base as we go forward. They are complex, there are many, and therefore they will require a systemic, long-term, continuous, and focus on that to deal with it. I will talk about later on about the Ukraine crisis and market distortion, what it does. But for me, front and center in investing in the data, the expertise, the institutional infrastructure to understand a vulnerability and to be prepared for shocks when they happen. I will mention an example that's is not Sahelian, but I think it's a good example to clarify what we need to do and where we need to be. In most places of the North, when it is winter, they know where to park the snow plows before the snow falls. They know exactly the areas of the cities where you're going to have a problem when the snow falls. We have to get to a place where we know the communities and the areas in our countries where the next shock is going to be hurting because of the absorption capacity is low, and try not just to build that capacity, but also to be prepared to position the snow plows so that when the shock comes, we can deal with it. So I'll stop here first, Joachim, and then thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Usman. Well, it was good to hear the snowplow example from the Sahel. It shows that you had your experience also in snowy Kiel in Germany and in Washington, D.C. Next, I would like to call on Dr. Dorothy Okello. Professor Okello is the Dean of the School of Engineering at Makerere University, Uganda, and a researcher with NET Labs, Uganda. She holds a PhD in electrical engineering from McGill University in Canada and is Director of Innovation at Resilient Africa Network. at the Makerere University School of Public Health. She served as president from 2016 to 2018 of the Ugandan Institution of Professional Engineers and has other commitments. Dorothy Okello is also an activist in the role of getting more women, small-scale enterprises and rural communities engaged in the innovation for development. Dorothy, please, your opening statement.
Thank you so much, Professor Joachim, for the very kind introduction. And also, I'm very happy to be a part of this webinar where we're discussing matters that are really prime and important, such as resilience and our food systems. As shared in terms of the bio, a lot of what I would have wanted to say in my opening remarks have been shared by the earlier speakers. This is a very pertinent topic right now. So what I want to add to, by way of my introduction, but also sharing a bit more on the topic, is coming from countries like ours where we have a very youthful population. Coming from my own setting, which is in a university, how do we tap the potential of the youth? How do we tap the potential of our students, whether here or University of Bonn, or because I see you in a university setting, or it looks like one at least, on that side there, so that together with the communities, we can better strengthen resilience towards the different shocks and stresses that will come by. Because I think, as Osman has shared, these are there. Right, but I really did love the snow example. So how do we make sure we are in the right place at the right time with our snow shovels? And having lived 5 years in Montreal, Canada, that example really drove home to me the point, because we did have a lot of snow to deal with. So one of the things that we really embrace and I really like as a model is a framework that was that we put together as the Resilient Africa Network, understanding first what is the context and how do we better plan for a particular context, a particular community, taking into account the different cultural and other dynamics that are within that community, and then understanding what are the key resilience dimensions so that we are more focused in terms of our solutions. Because certainly when we are addressing this challenge of our resilience, especially for our food systems, they think global, act local becomes really, really key in terms of what we need to do. And also it enables us, for particular communities that we are targeting, understand what is it that they have been doing already, all right, to strengthen their resilience against certain shocks and stresses, to adapt to certain shocks and stresses, and also looking at what have been positive mechanisms which we can come in with innovation and co-create to strengthen and make more robust, or what are the negative coping strategies that we need to address, which only serve actually to make them more vulnerable, even if on the face of it, it may look like it's addressing a given shock or a given stress. And following that kind of analysis, then we need to identify what are the priority intervention pathways. And again, doing really this in collaboration with the communities that are affected, with the policymakers. That's a really key perspective to this. But again, as I said, bringing the perspective of where the youth, for very young countries like ours, it's something which we think about a lot, where the youth, where the women, and what is their say on this? What is their input on this? And so that we come up with solutions that really speak to what the community needs are, and also speak to the creativity and innovation spirit that we have, so that we can actually strengthen collectively then community by community and the continent at large as we go along against these shocks and stresses. So this is something that I'm very much eager to have for this panel. Maybe by just finish my brief on this. One of the things that we have adopted, for example, at the School of Engineering is that yes, technology is great, and we do need it to solve a number of the issues in the food system sector, but how do they see themselves in that space beyond putting the AI or the robots and everything together? So a very simple thing we've done, for example, is that for every of their projects that they are working on, how does it relate to the Sustainable Development Goals? So that to help our students better appreciate the role that they themselves have to play. Because sometimes when you hear, things are always a food issue or it's a gender issue, you'll have the engineers asking, okay, but what's my space in that? I designed the technology. No, the technology has a very big role it can play in actually addressing resilience towards for a better and stronger food system in Africa. Thank you, Professor. I'll stop here for now.
We thank you, Dorothy Okello. Focus on youth, on women, on technology. Very important to get back to these points later on. Next in our opening statement series is Dr. Mahamadou Issoufou Wasmaya. He is the Regional Director for West and Central Africa and the Caribbean at Welthungerhilfe. You are in this job already since 3 years. You have 18 years of experience in humanitarian and development assistance, mainly in fragile context. 8 years with Welthungerhilfe. Dr. Mahamadou Issoufou Wasmaya has a PhD in biological science of the University of Carthage in Tunisia, with a focus on land use, climate change impacts, and arid and semi-arid ecosystems. Please take the floor.
Professor von Braun, thanks for the invitation, and I'm really happy to be part of these important discussions. As you mentioned, I'm responsible for at Welthungerhilfe for the West and Central Africa, where, well, food system is at the center of the life of and well-being of the African societies, as the livelihood, as you know, of the majority of African population depends on food-related activities. It has been already mentioned, but all component of, within the food systems, but also the systems that are related to or intercorrelated with the food systems are unfortunately currently affected by multiple interrelated Mrs. Opperman, but also Dr. Badian mentioned it. And these crises are also frequently, but then mutually reinforcing each other. The crises are at different level, as you know, the local level, but also the global level. It has been already mentioned as pandemic, the food crisis, and so on. These crises are worsening hunger in many African countries, as illustrated by the Global Hunger Index. You mentioned it, that was launched last week. And just to give you an example, in the Sahel region, more than 38 million people are currently facing acute food insecurity. So it is critical to act now, I would like to say, to rebuild food security on a new and lasting basis by investing in transformations toward equitable, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient food system. So the COP is an entry point, but then action needs to be happening on the ground. So this alarming situation should, however, not overshadow the numerous opportunities that are existing in the Sahel region, for instance, but also in many other African countries for the food system transformation. I will not give the example of the snow, but then in the Sahel region, these opportunities are also, for instance, the traditional knowledge, the indigenous knowledge when it comes to resilience or positive coping mechanism, employment for youth. I mean, the African population is, I think, more than 60% of the African population are under 25. So it is also a huge capital where we can invest on. So Welthungerhilfe, together with the local communities, together with our local partner organization, international organization, but also the local governments, we are currently investing and building on these opportunities to strengthen the resilience of food system against current shocks and future uncertainties. These interventions, they follow systemic, integrated, and interdisciplinary approach that build human, financial, social, natural, and also physical capital. I can give much more example. I hope I will have the occasion later on those interesting interventions. But the key or the trigger is that the success of these interventions, as well as scaling up such interventions, is only possible if all stakeholders, local communities, civil society organization, private sector, government, research institutions are really engaged and committed toward food system transformation. There I can also share later on, I hope so, I will have the occasion, such intervention that engage all those stakeholders that I've mentioned. Thanks.
Yes, there will be an opportunity. Thank you very much. You emphasized the components of stress need to be understood. Usman Badiane emphasized data and also that point. Your additional point was on the need to employment. That especially also relates to youth employment and interventions and stakeholder cooperation. I understand that all of you leave some issues open, and we want to push you a bit further on issues left open by the three speakers so far, especially how about social protection? The capacity to bounce back among the poor is impaired. I think we need to come to that also in the discussion later on. Before we do that, let me introduce Dr. Heike Baummüller, Senior Researcher at CEF and coordinator of the program of accompanying research for agricultural innovation, in brief, PARI. Since 2016, her research focuses on digital transformation for African food and agriculture. Previous research experience related to trade and investment policies, sustainable natural resources, through her work with Chatham House and the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. She got her PhD here at University of Bonn, and she is the lead author of the book, which brings us together today. Heike, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And let me first shed some light on the lottery. We have 10 copies of the book that we would like to give out to, we will select randomly from the list of Zoom participants that are joining and from the ones that registered for this event. And then you'll get a book, we'll get in touch with you and send it to wherever it needs to be sent. I would like to share a few thoughts from the book. I mean, this is a book that was written by a lot of people and draws on a lot of research of many years of research that we did in Paris and also other research. It's not only Paris research. So I'm just summarizing some points. When we started the book, we tried to answer the question, how could we, what does it take to boost food supplies in Africa from the use of African resources? And we quickly realized that it's not enough to look at the productive sector. We need to look much more at the food system, at the whole food supply chain. So this is why then the sort of some of the points I want to raise here go much beyond production. And I'd like to highlight just briefly three, let's say, short to medium term areas of interventions and two longer term areas of intervention. There's a lot more in this that you can find, but just a few that I highlight that are particularly relevant, I think, to this particular topic. So in terms of short and medium term, in fact, Professor Keller already started saying this, is the need to invest in technology and in infrastructure, but in a way that you have supportive governance structures, that you have incentive systems, you have institutions that mean that you don't just have technology for the sake of technology, as Professor was saying, but you have it in such a way that you have sufficient food, nutritious food, sustainable, and for the topic of this conversation, resilient food. So it's more than just the technology, is what sort of technology and how do you actually deploy it. So an example is that we talk about in the book is on small scale irrigation, that we need irrigation, but we also need to think about water saving technologies in irrigation, like drip irrigation. We need to think about how to monitor water use, how to have governance structures at the local level to manage water, and also how to have incentives for water saving. So it's much more than irrigation technology. The same with energy. So we are talking about off-grid and mini-grid solutions that might be most suitable, but then come from renewable resources in rural areas, or mechanization. So you don't have mechanization for the sake of mechanization, but you also have policies that support sustainable use of mechanization on the farm, for example, or mechanization to reduce post-harvest losses. And importantly, what we argue is that you need to look at these together as a package. So you think about, so where does an investment in, let's say, electricity and irrigation together make sense to have complementarities? The second major area, which is very much led by my colleague Alisha Mezabayev, is on sustainable land management. So he's arguing that we need to invest in existing land rather than in new land and promote sustainable land management practices on that land. And also to use that to attract finance through ecosystem services payments. But again, the governance structure is important, that we need land tenure security as well. The third area is on inclusive markets. So this is what I'm saying, is that we need to look at the whole chain. So inclusive markets at the local level, all the way to the Pan-African level. That needs infrastructure, but that also needs institutions like farmer organizations, and it needs more investments in commercialization and access to finance. In terms of a couple of long-term investments that will pay off in the longer term is investments in skill development. We are talking about skills along the entire value chain, not only at the production level, but in processing, but also in sustainability-related skills, logistics, accounting, and with a particular emphasis on vocational training, and to match education requirements, education with the requirements of the labor market, with a particular focus on women. There's always a gender lens throughout. And we also need to invest more in food systems R&D that pays off also in the longer term, to have innovations in technologies that build resilience, and to also improve linkages between research, private sector, extension services, and the users. And with that, I'll leave it for now.
Thank you, Heike. Well, you have given us, the audience, more appetite for the book. It's great material. Actually, there is no such book in the market currently. That's why we happily solicit it here. And there is certainly none in German language. To my surprise, even in the development community, there is quite a bit of preference to read in our good old home language. So I spread it around. Colleagues, I would like to proceed in the following way. We have about half an hour left in our session. I will give the panelists an opportunity to address some of the points which they sort of touched upon. In between, have your questions already here from the audience and from the web, if there are any. Sundus, are you monitoring that? So you wave when there are the first entries. So far, none, yeah? No, they are all very disciplined, but we are encouraging you to punch in your comments or question. I want to get back to you, Usman. You have recently completed a set of studies on the impact of the war, Russia's attack on Ukraine, on the African food system. That is one of the shock stories, the shocking shock stories for the African food system. What can African countries do to better prepare for these uncertainties? That was unpredictable. But you also mentioned you wanted to come back on the touchy topic of debt and debt relief. Can you make brief comments on these two issues? How can African countries address the price crises? How about, and related to that, the macroeconomic consequences through accumulating debt? Usman, please.
Thank you, Joachim. Let me start by saying that what they certainly cannot do, what a lot of people tend to talk about, is to turn away from global markets. The world markets are much more stable than regional markets, which are much more stable than domestic markets. So I think what we need to do is to engage in the global markets in a way that reduces our vulnerability to shocks that happens in all markets, global, regional, and national markets. But also we have to position ourselves such as to be able to respond to positive development. Even during shocks like the one we have now, there are some opportunities for countries to benefit from. Let me start by saying the way we looked at the shocks, a lot of people put their fingers on wheat, on vegetable oils and fertilizers. What we easily forgot is that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of markets that have been shocked and disrupted at the same time. So in the work that we did, we looked at 46 commodities that have been disrupted. The prices are moved around. And if you're a country, the way you're affected depends on your export and import baskets. Which commodities do you sell and which commodities do you buy? And how those different prices move. So you can be a country that actually can benefit from the movement of prices. If you're a major exporter of these minerals and gas and energy and so on, you are in a position to fetch higher prices for your exports. Of course, you're paying higher prices for your foods if you're importing them and other things. So at the end of the day is the capacity of the economy to react. So then what are the two things here that determine whether a country is really worse off or perhaps will come out a little bit unscathed? Depends on how broad the basket of export and import goods are. If you export a lot of goods, chances are you'll capture more goods with higher prices that will contribute to bringing money into the economy. If your economy can respond, and that's what I was talking about, it's going to be very important. So that is the first thing that is extremely important for these countries to know. What we also know is that from the data we got, most African countries were facing much higher increases in imports prices than they were in export prices. It wasn't, by the way, the case in the case of our COVID. So what that does is that it creates a balance of payment shocks to most of these countries. So making sure that you're not overextended in debt, that you have solid reserves, or at least lower levels of debt, allows you as a country in cases like this to be able to tap into financial sources and more consciously or not, financial flows to shore up the impact on the macroeconomy. So in addition to having a diversified trade regime with the rest of the world to spread the shock across more markets, in having a domestic environment that allow your sectors that benefit from these price increases to respond and sell more and export and bring in more money, by ensuring that those export sectors are broadly spread across the economy and are labor intensive. And finally, watching your debt level so that these shocks that will happen don't come and derail the entire economy. So those are entry points that will allow us to continue to do trade with the global markets, to reduce our vulnerability to shocks and benefit from both. Thank you.
Thank you, Usman. After each second statement, let's open up for questions here in the room and on the web. I see a signal from you, Sundus. Anyone in the room would like to jump on what Usman has just said? Sundus, you have the floor, please,
Yes,
on
thank
behalf
you.
of.
Yes, so Heike Fickel from the African Market Observatory in the University of Johannesburg has asked something related to what Dr. Badiani is saying, that she says, how do you see the role of regional trade in food security?
You got it, Usman? Regional trade?
Yes, I did. Actually, it's quite interesting. Let's go back to this very crisis. One thing that struck me, which I actually didn't know, is that when people were very worried about wheat and the disruption of wheat markets, we went back and started collecting data on how exposed individual countries were. Exposed in terms of how much they were import dependent on supplies from Ukraine, Belarus, or Russia. But also we looked at how much import penetration they were facing. In other words, how much of the consumption was being imported. And we discovered that 23 African countries were importing much more wheat than they needed. And they don't store wheat, we know that. So what happens actually is that you have a very active re-export market. So what is a global shock becomes a regional shock because of the re-exports, right? So you are not insulating regional markets from global market shocks anyway because of things like that. But what we have seen as well is that there are areas where African countries can actually see these opportunities to develop regional trade and cross-border trade much more than they are doing right now. But it's going to be coming at a cost in a sense that you'll be diverting from more stable global markets to regional markets. But also on the other side, the positive side, it creates jobs, it creates resources, and it integrates regional markets much more. So there are sectors where you can do that. It depends on the countries. We just issued a report. If you were to go back to the Academia 2063 website and you look for the Ukraine reports, there are several countries that are positioned to be competitive in specific segments, whether it's oilseed or it's cereals. There are countries across all regional blocks that can actually be competitive and increase the role in regional markets. But it's going to be marginal compared to what's coming from the global markets. Thank you.
Matthias Morge has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much. A couple of years ago, the African Continental Free Trade Zone was launched, and I just wonder how you assess the current appetite in Africa for opening up markets. I mean, in the food price crisis, we have seen that several countries have actually stopped exporting food commodities from their countries. So I wonder whether this is actually a counterproductive trend or whether this was just temporarily. How do you assess the current situation?
There's no question that interfering with cross-border trade really hurts everyone during the times of crisis. Just example, I just mentioned here of wheat, which is not even growing. It's growing in about 10 African countries, but most of it is imported. even there, what's coming from global markets enters into the regional trading system. So stopping trade across borders is certainly not a good way. And the global community has learned that. If you look at the food price crisis of 2008 and 2011, the difference was that the global community coordinated better in 2011 to allow trade and then to minimize export bans and the like. So now coming back to AFCFTA, the fact that so many African countries have ratified the agreement certainly tells us there's an appetite for it. Is it going to be easy because of that? Of course not. So the implementation of the different schedules of tariff liberalization and non-tariff measures, removal is going to be a lengthy and complicated travel journey, but I do think that it's going to happen. I see two risks to AFCFTA. First, it is loopholes allowing countries to carve out some sectors, in particular around agriculture, because of the status they will give them. And this is the most dynamic trading sector. The more it is excluded from the implementation schedule, the less we will benefit from AFCFTA. Then second, and this is the last point I make, the non-tariff measures are the main obstacles to intra-African trade, not tariff measures. And those are going to be very complicated to deal with as well. So yes, the appetite is there, implementation is going to be long and messy, and the first are probably not going to be coming up anytime soon. But it's good and worthwhile to start the journey right now. Thank you.
Well, we certainly need to watch a lot more what's happening on the trade front. It's the terms of trade, which you, Usman, outlined, the implications for especially the terms of trade between energy and minerals and food, triggering massive Dutch disease problems, and now the rising US dollar and the rising interest rates, making the investments, which all our panelists were asking for, much more difficult. Dorothy Okello, Professor Okello, you are part of the Resilient Africa Network, RAN. That's hosted by Makerere University. And it's a multidisciplinary network of about 20 African universities. We here in a university setting are particularly interested to hear from you. What are solutions proposed by this network? How can they be scaled? Tell us more, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, for that question. Let me first maybe start by sharing about RAN's definition for resilience, which really, not the definition, but what do we seek in terms of addressing resilience? One, reducing vulnerability, and two, increasing well-being. And as I shared earlier, working with the community at hand. And the issue that we have is that basically in terms of the theory of change is that if we strengthen knowledge, and this because we come also for the university setting, okay, we are leveraging knowledge, we are leveraging scholarship, we are leveraging a community to incubate, test, and scale different innovations, which is what you're asking about. But I thought I'd give it a background. And why are we doing this? To target capabilities and also, they reduce the vulnerabilities based on the evidence that is drawn. So there'll be some micro-assessment studies done in a particular community that we're looking at. So what are some of the innovations, therefore, that we've supported? And I thought I would use, some of the key priorities that were identified in the book that we're going to launch to share this using the link that has been shared out with everyone. First, the issue of youth. That I mentioned, and skilling. So we've been doing a number of boot camps and working with the local community and our own students, bring them together to solve different challenges. Sometimes it would take the traditional form of a hackathon or the like, because the issue is that the people in the community have been adapting in one way or another. So how do we harness that? How do we increase the positive, but scale back on the negative? So some of the simple things have been like, how do we do irrigation? solar-based irrigation, how do we size that? Solar-based drying, using very simple elements, taking care of the physics so that hot air burning over iron sheets can then come into the chamber, right? Using the principle of physics that hot air will rise up. So how do we do some of these innovations to promote the resilience? The other example that I can give is around the issue of mobile connectivity, because that's my area in particular, so I can speak all day about it, and in addressing digital transformation. So why do we want the digital transformation? First of all, in the rural communities that we've been targeting, you find that a number of the farmers, there will be smallholder farmers, but if you're coming to buy the produce, you're looking at more than a basin of beans. So how do we come up with applications that can actually aggregate the produce that you have from the different smallholders, so that for a middleman or a factory or an industry, you now have sufficient quantity generated, even if at each household you have 1 or 2 animals, or you have 1 or 2 basins of produce. But collectively and using technology, you can combine this, aggregate that, and then you have access to the market. And also on top of that, if we're going to have a digital transformation, then you need a network, right? And you need infrastructure in place. And this infrastructure is both the network itself, but also the devices. So we are actually at the moment setting up in northern Uganda a rural broadband-based network where we are using a combination of TV white spaces and Wi-Fi, and using the large-scale operators for our backhaul in order to bring affordable internet access into the community, so that they can take advantage of the different apps that are being generated, so that either accessing to inputs, right? And if they can buy as a community, they'll get a lower price than people trying to buy individually. Also for the suppliers, suddenly where you were seeing 1 or 2 people, you can see a bigger market. So these are some of the innovations that we've been working on. And then also another innovation is some of the other innovations are also addressing the post-harvest handling, because there's one that we produce all this food, and you have, even if it's 1 or 2 basins of beans or whatever produce, if you lose that, you're back to really negative, if I may put it in that way. So technologies that support drying, technologies that support threshing of the produce, and that do this with either renewable energies such as biogas that can be locally generated, such as solar power that can be locally generated, so that you are minimizing the use of the grid, because in many of these places, access to grid power would be an issue, okay? Using locally available materials to be able to put this together, using AI, artificial intelligence, so that, for example, in pest management, you have AI-based apps that can help diagnose the diseases for either, one example we have is for passion fruit, another is for cattle.
Dorothy, this
Yes,
is
please.
a great menu, which we are now convinced it's a great network, a great menu. Do you
All right.
an interrupting question from
Sure.
Martin Keim? Martin?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. My question relates, if I understand you correctly, your examples and priorities were primarily from strengthening agricultural resilience or smallholder farmers' resilience. And my question is, to what extent do you and your network consider non-agricultural rural employment generation part of the resilience or the priority list for greater resilience, given that population growth in rural areas is still relatively large and farms are small and getting smaller in many parts of Africa? So non-agricultural rural labor markets, is that something that you also address with your network?
Yes, it is. And this is an area I'm very passionate about, so I'm sorry if I talk on and on and on about this. But yes, I've focused mainly on the agriculture ones, given that we're talking about food. But as you rightly said, health, public health, a big area. Population and population management, another big area that we are working in. And you remind me of an example that we did in Eastern Uganda, and basically the community was complaining that the land is getting small, right? The land was not getting small. The people are getting more for the same piece of land. So here we're looking at policy, and also policy is also a big area for this that we have to address. So basically, as I shared earlier, each community will have different priority areas that we then target. We have areas where conflict is the major constraint or major hindrance towards the food systems, right? So what are different mechanisms, and this may not always be technology related, that we can have in place for conflict resolution, because that then affects the food systems. So depending on what are the major constraints to resilience in a community, this is what we would be targeting. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Let's move northwest to the Sahelian region. We have heard already from Dr. Issoufou Wasmaier a little bit, but you promised us to give us some key intervention examples. You heard about a menu from Uganda. Tell us more from the region and about what Welthungerhilfe does successfully in the Sahel region. We need to move on to.
Thanks, Professor von Braun. Welthungerhilfe has also an extended menu, but due to the time, I will try to somehow limit my intervention. But if you allow, let me share personal experience, two personal experience, because I came from Niger, from the Fulani community, which is pastoral community. So when I was about 15 years old, I used to accompany one of my uncle to graze his animal. So it was cattle and goat and so on. And we use to move from a grazing area to another one. Yeah, and in doing so, we use also specific grazing roads. We were moving between grazing roads, though there were enough pasture, right, on each grazing land. The second experience I would like to share is that also I do have uncles that who used to move to the big cities around Dogonduchi, where I'm born. And they used to go to Duchi or I mean, nearby big cities, and even to Nigeria, the neighboring country. And they used to send money back home. They moved there because of seasonal jobs, seasonal opportunities, employment opportunities. And later on during my studies, I've learned that animal rotation is an efficient grazing land management measure, but also using specific grazing road is part of conflict prevention measure around natural resources. And also remittance contributes to the household resilience. So why am I sharing that with you? It is really to illustrate that African communities, mainly in Sahel region, have been confronted or to shock and have also developed knowledge, traditional knowledge, traditional indigenous knowledge that are part of their coping mechanism. Some of them are good, some of them are not good. But now, though the shocks really become much more complex, as we know, at the local level, but also at the global level, those globally exacerbating what is already existing as vulnerability. I think indigenous or traditional knowledge can be a lever in developing actions to strengthen the resilience of Africa's food system. So now an outlook on the Welthungerhilfe menu, I would like to say. So example of promising interventions that we are currently conducting in the Central Sahel, it is Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, together with our the communities and partners. For instance, social protection, you've mentioned it. We used to do it through cash transfer. That helps IDP, internal displaced person, and host communities such as in Difa, in Niger, but also in Kongusi, in Burkina Faso, to meet their minimum baskets, food basket needs, but also to improve risk management in a rural area. Another social protection intervention that we are conducting is, employment and entrepreneurship, mainly, I mean, both in agriculture, but also in non-agriculture, I mean, off-farm sector with a focus on youth and women. This improve rural economy and livelihood, such as in the Liptako Gourma, that is the three border, the border area, trans-border area between Burkina Faso and Mali. And there, another impact is that it also reduced the enrollment of youth by those armed groups that populated this region. Another intervention is the sustainable land management. This includes soil, lands, water, and we also promote women inclusion. We combine restoration, soil restoration with climate resilient agriculture and agroecology to diversify and improve agricultural production. To give you an example, in Niger, together with crises, which is also a research institute, we support women group to access degraded communal land that they receive as form of donation by the local authority. We support them to restore the land and to promote small-scale irrigation for food production, processing, but also marketing. Local governance is another promising intervention. And there we centered our action on community management, on food, fodder, and credits, such as the establishment of a so-called warrantage system in Niger to improve food availability and access during the lean season. Community-based early warning system is another intervention that we support the local community in the region of Difa with the help of Agrimet to access information on weather patterns affecting their area, and to share also information about risk, about incidents, as well as tendencies with the National Coordination Center.
I'm afraid I need to do the same here as in the case of Uganda, an impressive menu, which I think calls for a lot of impact-oriented research. And I know that Welthungerhilfe is progressing with learning with these programs. Sundus, is a big accumulation. I want to give Heike one more time the floor, but how does it look on the web?
Yes, we do have two questions. We have a few questions. Two of them relate to international collaboration. So
why don't you read them to us, and we see if we can catch up on them in the context of wrapping up. And Heike is also listening, and the others as well.
All right.
They in the end get 1 minute closing statements.
Okay. So Dr. Stephen Edizoro has asked broadly on the role of the international NGOs in sub-Saharan Africa. And then Professor Nick Olivia from South Africa has asked if it would be possible for the international community to work with the African Union to develop a detailed framework for the collection of credible and verifiable data, similar to the AU framework for the development of NAIPs and the Malibu Biennial Review Indicators.
Okay, the data issue, maybe Usman, you can jump on again, but also Heike is interested in that. Heike, I think we have waved with the book. It has so much content. What would you like to highlight? What hasn't gotten sufficient attention in the last 45 minutes?
Well, I do have a certain bias because my research area is digitalization in food and agriculture. So I'm afraid I'll have to talk a little bit more about that, but just very briefly, because I know it was already mentioned a few times, but I think I'd like to broaden it a little bit and also talk about practicality. So in terms of the potential of digitalization, I mean, Usman mentioned data for decision making. I'd like to go one step further, data for automated decision making. What we're finding in our research is that, in fact, in the food and beverage processing sector in Africa, we were interested to find a high level of mechanization and a surprisingly high level of automation as well. So I think for quality control and market participation, that's an interesting development. I also want to highlight, and this is a broader topic than digitalization, but it plays a role, is access to finance and financial services, which I think for de-risking and for market participation is essential, be it mobile payments, be it insurance schemes that are facilitated by digital technologies, and be it also access to loans through use of data. But then what we're also seeing, and I think to be realistic, is that we talk about the digital transformation of African food and agriculture, but the question is whether it's actually happening, because we have a lot of solutions, but we don't really have many users of those. It's quite a small percentage of Africans that are using digital agricultural solutions that are being promoted. And it's not for the lack of solutions, it's for the lack of linking solutions to users. And I think I'd like to pose two areas where I think we need to expand our efforts to establish those linkages. And one is around building digital bridges, so around connectivity, which I think is fantastic what Dorothy was talking about, but also digital platforms that facilitate access. But I'm also advocating for building human bridges in terms of skill development, but also to that the human intermediary in the digital agriculture will always remain crucial because of the importance of face-to-face and the importance of trust relationships. So this is my pitch for digitalization.
Thank you. Usman, you heard the question, AU relationships and data. Please go ahead. 1 minute, I make a quick round for each of you. Usman?
Thank you very much. I'll be quick. Thank you, Nick, Oliver, for the question. This is something that will be possible, but to do it will take a lot of efforts and a lot of time, not necessarily a lot of money, but it has to be organized. The issue is getting data right now and getting a partnership around data is that the global community think that it is investing quite a bit in data, and it may be right. There are efforts being subsidized and funded by the global community, like the living standard measurement surveys, the 50 by 30, the global statistics, yet those are not covering nearly, a fraction of the data that's needed. At the country level, agriculture is a vast sector and a long chain. From inputs all the way to exports, getting a consistent and coherent data set is not an easy thing to do because you have dozens of institutions, each responsible for one snippet of the data chain. So even if they were to cover the entire chain, the frequency, the standards, the units, things will be different. So you wouldn't just be able to eat that soup. So one will have to go really systematically, country by country, and do that. We have shown with the binary review, as Professor Oliver said, that it can be done, but it will take that systematic approach country by country, and indeed in partnership with the African Union at the continental and regional level to do something like that. We're nowhere close to it just because the feeling of the global community is that enough is being invested in data already through those efforts that I mentioned. Thank you.
Dorothy, your takeaway message.
Thank you, Prof. My takeaway message, I think I follow Heike. I am biased, of course, to technology, and digital transformation in particular is a great opportunity for us also to tap both into the youth that are in the informal sector that have not had much schooling but are all over their phones, plus those who are in school or at the university setting. And I would greatly welcome further collaboration for different universities getting together on this. I think that is very important. I think it's very important too that we are co-creating solutions with the community, taking advantage of their local knowledge, taking advantage of how they've already sought to adapt to different ways so that we can build on that creatively for more resilient and sustainable solutions to having better food systems in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Mohamedou, there was this question about working with African NGOs. Do you have any comment on that and your brief takeaway message?
Well, African NGOs are key players when it comes to humanity. I'm not sure, sorry. I mean, well, we call them local organization, local civil society organization, but also, yeah. So they are a key player in the development, humanitarian, but also resilience efforts together with the government in these countries. So our work together is at the same time a win-win situation where we learn from the local experience, expertise, but also they receive kind of training when needed from our side. Well, as a takeaway, I'm really happy that the digital transformation about agriculture is mentioned here, because we also, Weltunga Hilfe, have a good experience in Uganda, and we are planning to launch also such program for Francophone countries in Africa through apps that provide informations to farmers, to also dealers. I mean, like output intern and input dealers, intermediate with agricultural extension, marketing information to increase production and income. Thank you.
Thank you. Heike, other than read our book, what's your takeaway message?
Well, obviously to read our book and the free version that's available. I think when we talk about resilience, I think we need to talk about the fact that, I see you have your microphone on. Okay. When we talk about resilience, I think we get back to sort of the basis of sustainable development, that we need to think about the fact that environmental protection, developmental and economic objectives, and of course social security and social development objectives are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We need to think about trade-offs and complementarities, and I think this is ultimately how we can build resilience to make environmental protection worthwhile for economic development and for sustainable food systems.
Thank you. Colleagues, time is too short to dig deeper. Why are we in trouble regarding resilience in the food system? And what's new? The trouble is that we have 3 covariate shocks, not individual shocks hitting this household or that community, but covariate at big scale. First, the pandemic, then the food price crisis, partly triggered by the Russian war in Ukraine, and climate change and the triggering of massive droughts, for instance, in East Africa, and the flooding. So the covariate shocks. How can we deal with covariate shocks? Of course, we have heard beautiful examples from East Africa and from the Sahel region. Very important to involve community, but we also need the continental and international engagement, because these shocks are too big to treats them with local action only. That's where trade, macro, investment, finance, development aid, scaled up development aid for social protection, for the health protection comes in. And the huge challenge which this book addresses is, and which the Malabo Montpellier panel keeps addressing, is we must not miss out on the focus, strategic focus for the long term while trying to manage the short term. So those are the challenges which we could only touch upon. Thank you to all panelists. Thank you to all who spoke from the audience. Sundus, is there anyone angry on the web who would like to get a comment over? Then we close with that. Anyone who hasn't had a chance to be heard?
Yes, so the question was, how do you see the cost of environment compared to economic development, such as food availability? For example, we have accepted to the policy of wetlands management. Some are now prohibited for agriculture, but they are the most fertile soils in the country. What is your comment on that? Thank you. And then there was a question from an anonymous attendee who says that what action is being taken to work with governments to increase their willingness to deal with some internal issues that could improve resilience. You find most of the projects set to increase resilience for smallholder farmers are either mismanaged or funds embezzled.
Well, thank you for engaging. Your voices have been heard. We pick them up in a future seminar. Good evening and goodbye to everyone. Thank you.